How's it rolling? Today we are taking a look at Delta Airlines, the largest or second largest carrier in the United States, depending on which metric you choose. We'll take a look at a potential order for 100 737 MAX aircraft, and then after we'll discuss why I think Delta, despite the coronavirus outbreak, is in a fairly healthy position, all aspects considered. So first, let's start with the 737 MAX order. Among the big three airlines, Delta is the only carrier who have not ordered the 737 MAX. Up until the outbreak, this was a huge advantage for Delta. United and American, along with Southwest, were forced to ground their fleets since early March. In their 2019 annual report, Ed Bastian, Delta's CEO, stated regarding the MAX situation, "We've clearly been a beneficiary, and as long as the MAX stays out of the skies, it looks like we'll continue to be one." The reason is pretty simple. Delta chose to order the Bombardier C Series, or as it is now known, the Airbus A220-100. At the time, they placed an initial order for 75 of the smallest A220 in 2016. In 2019, they added an additional 20 frames to this order and reconfigured the order to consist of 45 total A220-100s and 50 total A220-300s. The 300 was scheduled for delivery in mid-2020, but that will likely be pushed back a little bit. Delta started receiving their A220s in early 2019 and deployed them on routes between 800 and 1,400 miles long. I actually had my first Delta One flight between Denver and Seattle in March of last year, on N122DU, which at the time was only 2 months old. The A220 has been a huge asset for Delta. Outside of being insanely efficient, it has been very popular with its customers. For the most part, it is replacing high-capacity regional routes operated by full Embraer E-Jets and older, less filled 717s, A319s, and 737s. For example, the A220-100 in a 115-seat configuration on a 600-mile route consumes around 10.1 pounds of fuel per mile. A standard 737-800 burns 12.7 pounds of fuel per mile. This averages to a saving of 21% per mile. And even as a fan of the MD-95, I have to admit, the A220 is objectively more comfortable in first class or the back of the plane and has way more features for me as a passenger. According to TPG, the points guy, Delta is currently flying all of its A220 aircraft amid the outbreak. During this time, Delta is parking many of their 757s, 717s, some of their wide bodies, and the entire MD-90 fleet. So back to the 737 MAX. How can Delta afford an order during this time? Well, it's not really due to their financial successes over the past few years, nor is it thanks to ordering certain aircraft. It really has to do with Delta's ownership model. Unlike most US airlines, Delta owns 79% of their mainline fleet. They have leases for 193 aircraft, or 21% of their fleet, and of these leased aircraft, the Boeing 717, or MD-95, comprises 40% of that total figure. As it was before coronavirus, Delta was in the process of retiring their older MD-XX fleet. Delta had an average fleet age of 14.6 years. The MD-88s were an average of 28.7 years old, and the MD-90s clocked in around 23 years old. That's not old by human standards, otherwise I'm an old guy, but that is old for a commercial fleet. So how does this relate to the 717 or MD-95, which only averaged 18 years and has spent less than 5 years at Delta? Simply put, in 2017, the FAA issued an airworthiness directive requiring Delta to, eventually, replace the seats on their entire 717 fleet. The FAA gave Delta 5 years, until 2022, to do this. Of course, the 717 actually has some of the newest seats in the fleet and had just finished being retrofitted. This, combined with old age, comparative lack of efficiency to newer planes like the A220 that have same capacity and range, and not owning them, means coronavirus is really presenting Delta an opportunity. With capacity expected to decrease, Delta needs less planes. It can now justify grounding their older aircraft earlier as they already have next-generation aircraft that meet their current and eventual demands. IATA estimates that global capacity is going to drop by 48% compared to last year. You might ask, where is the money for new airplanes coming from? There's not an exact answer, but we can speculate. As most of Wall Street knows, Delta, when compared to United and American, have run the most financially solvent operation for the last decade since merging with Northwest Airlines. 10 years of solid financial performance prepares a company for times like this. Another thing to consider, the 737 MAX grounding. Boeing is desperate, simply put, to start selling the MAX again. This means they will likely offer huge discounts to a top-tier carrier like Delta that has not ordered the MAX yet. As it is, industry estimates indicate airlines typically pay 60 to 70% of list price for an aircraft that is flying. Also of note, just this month, Boeing lost orders for 150 737 MAX aircraft. 39 of these cancellations came from the Brazilian carrier Gol. Delta previously had a 3% stake in that Brazilian airline. Delta is now in a position where they could requisition some of these canceled 737 MAX aircraft. Remember that despite the grounding, Boeing was still churning out 737 MAXs at the normal rate of 42 per month. The coronavirus outbreak stopped their production. And now Boeing has hundreds of 737 MAXs parked around Washington state. To encourage the deal, Boeing is considering the acceptance of the Boeing 717 as a trade-in for assignment of 737 MAX aircraft. This has actually happened in the past, where Boeing accepts an aircraft they don't produce or did not originally design as collateral. For example, in 2012, Boeing purchased 5 China Eastern A340-600s in order to secure an order for 20 Boeing 777-300ERs. This is a short-term and long-term play for Boeing, and for Delta. By offloading the 717, Delta no longer has to make payments. They would have to make payments for the 737 MAX around each frame's delivery time, but not for the entire order and not all at once. It's also important to remember the 737 MAX does not have a delivery date quite yet. So overall, this is a short-term and long-term cost deferral. It's a cost deferral that really only Delta, as far as the major carriers are concerned, is potentially able to do. Furthermore, while Delta does a great job at maintaining their older fleet and providing the best passenger experience with them, simply put, their older fleet has to be retired eventually. And if Delta is able to secure this transaction, they will easily see a continued status as being the top dog of this industry. With all of that in mind, Delta's CEO, Ed Bastian, is indicating that we should expect a smaller and slimmer Delta. The company just posted its first loss in over 8 years. They lost $422 million pre-tax dollars in the first quarter of 2020, which is a huge turn from posting over $1 billion in profit last quarter, along with huge employee bonuses. Just this February, Delta paid out $1.6 billion to its employees. They have paid out over $1 billion 6 years in a row to their employees. And while this sounds bad, it's not all doom and gloom. Delta has been doing better through the situation than even they expected. Originally, their updated guidance for the quarter indicated that they expected to lose around 70 cents per share outstanding. The earnings report that was just released a few days ago indicated an actual loss of 50 cents per share. Last year, they earned 96 cents per share. First quarter sales dropped 18% to $8.59 billion. If you're interested in stock analysis, there are channels for that, and I want to remind you that share price is only one indicator of a company's success. To really understand a company, you should definitely do your own due diligence and try to understand the financial metrics in full. And you might say a loss is a loss, but finance goes a little deeper than that, especially when airlines are concerned. Despite a drop of 18%, they did still make $8.59 billion. That is not worthless, far from it. Delta, as always, is being proactive for its brand, customers, and most importantly, their Delta family. Since March, Delta has raised $5.4 billion in capital. $1.2 billion of this comes from an aircraft sale-leaseback agreement. The US government issued an additional $1.6 billion loan in return for 6.5 million shares of Delta stock. Overall, Delta has secured $10 billion in liquid assets and cash at the end of 2020 Q2. The company is in the process of cutting their daily cash burn in half from $100 million per day to $50 million. On this, Ed Bastian states, "We do know that Delta will be a smaller carrier for some time. We should prepare for a sloppy and sluggish recovery even after the coronavirus is successfully contained. The recovery period could take 2 to 3 years." While this is a terrible situation, I think Delta, like always, has an innate ability to play their cards carefully and with intelligence. Airline industry employees are some of the strongest and most passionate people out there. I'm confident that Delta, an airline that means so much to me, will see this time through and act in a manner that will ensure long-term future success. While it sucks seeing Delta planes parked around the world, Delta people have been through a lot. Over the years, they've happily and graciously allowed many other airlines into their family, something that other airlines struggle with even years later. It's important to remember that Delta is the airline with employees who, 35 years ago, in a similar situation of tough financial times, refused failure for an airline they loved. They came together and purchased a Boeing 767 for the airline. They named this aircraft, registered N102DA, the spirit of Delta. I know the spirit of Delta lives on today in the hearts of all of its employees, especially the ones I know, even the grounded ones. Delta will survive, and clear skies are ahead. Keep climbing, Delta.